Well, I wanted to say a very warm welcome to Meg Rickards and Paul Egan, Meg, the director of Tess, and Paul, the producer. And huge congratulations to you both and to your amazing team on this extraordinary film. I particularly want to mention your cinematographer, and we'll speak about Bird Hates Malaysia, and your editor, Linda Manzon. I know that you've received incredible accolades and stupendous reviews about this film, both in South Africa and internationally. So congratulations on what has to be one of the most harrowing films I've seen in a long time. Meg, many of you will know, is an award-winning South African filmmaker, director, screenwriter, and also an accomplished academic. And Paul, who is her husband, is the producer of Tess, but has also worked with Meg on other feature films and documentaries. So, Meg, I want to say, just as a fellow Cape Townian and a UCT law graduate, I practiced law in South Africa and Australia, but my last few years, well, 15 years, have been as an academic, and I have, through my research, had a focus in the last few years, particularly on gender inequality and its violent manifestations in different settings, including in post-apartheid South Africa. And I have to say that I've been exposed to a lot of difficult stuff and material in doing that work, but your film it hit such a nerve, and I found it so hard to watch on so many levels. In fact, at times I almost had to stop it and then to go back, because it was just so extraordinarily made. This is your first, as I understand it, and please tell me if I'm wrong, this is your first theatrical feature film, and it's so beautiful to watch. I think that's what struck me, that the sound, the light, the colors, the landscape is very beautifully filmed by your cinematographer. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly you're pulled into the content of the film, at times for me very reluctantly, because you're pulled in very up close to the ravaged lives of Tess and her community. A performance by Christia Visser that is just incredible, absolutely incredible. And I was sort of almost relieved when there were those moments that your film portrayed of care and connection within that community, interspersed with the very violent depiction. And so my first question to you, Meg, is, this is such a harrowing film, and I was intrigued to know why you made the decision, you and your team obviously, to make the violence and the degradation so explicit and so brutal. Why did you not, in your words, in an interview you gave some years ago, why did you choose not to simply suggest the violence, but rather to show it in all its brutality?
Thanks, Andy, and for all your kind words. I think that violence towards women and children, gender-based violence in South Africa, is so out of control that I felt that it needed a kind of intervention, an artistic intervention, obviously not to solve the problem, but to try and instigate discussion. And I felt for that a very visceral approach was needed. I felt that there was so much academic discourse on the matter, and there were so many statistics out there. The stat at the time that we made it was that there were an estimated 3,600 rapes of women every day in South Africa. And academics were saying that a woman in South Africa growing up was more likely to be raped than to learn to read. And I wanted to try to filter those facts through something which would really make people feel. So we deliberately took a very showing approach. I wanted the audience to have to suffer along with Tess. I wanted to put them in her shoes very deliberately so that they could really feel that pain on some level, obviously only a symbolic one, but I wanted to focalize their experience through her. So it was a very deliberate decision to make the pain very real. And it was a dangerous tactic, and it's something we can maybe discuss more, But I felt very strongly at the time that this was what was needed because the stats weren't enough. And I think there's been a lot more dialogue since 2015 when we shot the film, but really with the Me Too movement, I think some of that's exploded. But at the time, I felt that there was still too many taboos around discussing this, and I wanted to force the issue into the light. So that was why we took a very deliberate approach. Yes, it was very intentional. I thought as an activist film.
Great. Well, you've achieved that objective head on, Meg. So something that did worry me, though, was the ethics of the violence that you depict. And as a filmmaker and a director, you know, the lines that you cross sometimes sort of are quite worrying. And there might be a criticism that perhaps it's voyeuristic or even pornographic, in some quarters might see it like that. But on the other hand, too, I was concerned about the people in the film. Christia Fisser, you know, portraying that woman that you describe, what she went through. Josie, the young daughter of a co-worker. Even your cinematographer who has to go in really close and film some pretty horrendous stuff, and then your editor who has to then go through all this harrowing footage and make decisions about what to use. So what, as a director, did you feel your obligations were in relation to maybe triggering trauma amongst even your crew and the actors?
So I think that's a very important question. And I do think this was a very traumatic film to work on, and for all of us. And I maybe underestimated how much so, but we definitely thought about it a lot. So I sat down in the rehearsal process. We had a very intensive rehearsal process for 3 weeks, and I wasn't sitting practicing the lines or rehearsing the scenes as such, but it was doing some very deep character work. And when we decided to I wanted to do the rape scene, and I wanted to make it very in the face, and I wanted the audience experience with Tess. And I sat with Christia Fisser and with Brendan Daniels, who plays Merrick, the rapist. It was very traumatic for him too. And I showed them some examples from different films. And I said I wanted to take a very dangerous approach, and how did they feel about it? And at this point, they'd done quite a lot of character work, and they said, we're ready to do it. We think it's necessary. And the one thing we decided at that point, long before we started filming, is that with the actual rape, they would give it their all, but we'd only film it once. We'd do one tracking shot, and it didn't matter what happened. We would only do it once because they had to be able to go there and not have to redo it again. And on the day, the shot actually went a little bit out of focus, and the director of photography and the focus puller and the grip who was pushing the dolly came to me afterwards and said, we need to refilm this shot. And it's a long 2-minute rape shot, even longer. And I said, we can't do it. And they said, but you have to, it goes out of focus. And I said, we can't. I made that deal. And in the end, the editor worked really well with it, with sound design. And it does go a little bit out of focus, but I actually think it works, and we're in a kind of interior space. So there were limits that we had to put. And we did make provision for Christia to do some therapy, and we just had to be very supportive of her throughout. But it did take its toll. But I know from visiting festivals with Christia and spending a lot of time with her, and we've done another film since together, actually a comedy, that she's really glad she did this film, and it was a big turning point, but it took huge guts. As for the children, you know, my mother, myself, and I was very determined that they would be protected. So the little girl who plays Josie, lots of people get worried about the shot where she looks like she's seeing the rape. But in fact, she wasn't on set at all when we filmed the rape. And that was quite dissociated, that shot through the screen window. So she actually had a great time on set, and I don't think she was too traumatized by it. I worked very carefully with her in an imaginative space, and the scene where she gets kidnapped by Merrick, she was completely within the fantasy of it. She knew he was a bad man, but he's a lovely actor and a bad man in the film, but he was very sweet to her. So it was okay. She was able to, in a supported way, enter that space. And as for the little girl in the flashbacks for Tess, that's actually Paula, my own daughter. And I felt that those scenes about abuse were very difficult to ask any mother to ask the child to perform. And I knew that I could keep her safe. One day, maybe when she's 16, we'll have to pay for therapy as she deals with what she did, but she had a fantastic time with set. She ate far too much yogurt and walked around like a queen bee. So again, she didn't know what she's doing, which maybe is exploitative, but I like to think that she'll be proud that she'll understand what she did and what she committed. I've told her since, because she's 11 now, what it was about, and I've said she can watch it when she's 16 because that's the age restriction. So yeah, and as for the voyeurism, I never thought of it as being pornographic at all. I maybe for some very sick-minded people there might be that, and that's really awful. But there's so much disgusting material out there that I don't feel. I mean, there's stuff that's far worse and far more explicit. So yeah, there've been a few freaky comments on social media, but I think that that's kind of by the by. I'm far more interested in the people's lives who's it's touched more constructively. Maybe we can talk about that.
Yes, I'd like to get back to that.
Yeah. But it was tough for the actors, I'm aware. And I mean, we were also quite traumatized by making it and spending so much time with that material. And it's not a kind of film that I could make over and over again. It was for a very specific time and place. And I'm very glad we made it. Arguably, we crossed some lines, but I think sometimes it's important to do that, because otherwise, if we always play it safe and always hover on the side of safety, I also think that that's wrong when gender-based violence carries on with impunity. And I felt that this almost a slight line crossing was necessary within the context.
Just to add a little anecdote, obviously there's the rape scene, which is extremely traumatic. And I recall very clearly is after it had been filmed, you know, the crew gather around Christia, make sure she's covered. Are you okay? And her words were, "How's Brendan?" So Brendan Daniels, who plays the perpetrator, and just a lovely little moment afterwards. They went and had a hug, and yeah. So for both of them, extremely traumatic. But you know, it's all degrees as well. So we did also show the film to a cinema of sex workers, active sex workers, and I mean, the interesting thing is that, you know, the level of violence that was depicted in the movie and the level of violence that they're exposed to were just poles apart. So I thought that was also quite interesting to...
Yeah, it was actually very interesting. There were some white American academics in the audience, and it was organized by a unit at Wits, and most of the cinema was sex workers. And the women from America were very upset, and there was one who was particularly angry. Whereas the sex workers came to us afterwards and said, "Thank you for showing it really how it was." So it's very much dependent on context as well. Many South African women have said this is the texture of their lives, and they're really glad to see it portrayed accurately. Whereas I think sometimes for more privileged women, it's tougher. So it's also audience dependent and context dependent.
I want to move to how you funded this film, because I would imagine trying to find the funding for a film like this, it's so controversial and very uncomfortable. It's not an appealing subject to fund something like this. And you took what I thought was a very unorthodox approach to raising funds, and I want you to talk about that. Paul, as a producer, could you tell us about how you did that in I'm sure you know what I'm referring to.
Sure. Absolutely. So, I mean, anyone would know that funding any film is it's a long process. It's a steep uphill climb, and you know, there's so many scripts out there and so many films that don't come to fruition simply because there's not money to back it. So, you know, we had Tess. We did based on the book Whiplash, and unfortunately, the film came out just as we were in pre-production, which won various Oscars, called Whiplash. So that's why we switched the name to Tess. So we were out there trying to raise funding, and typically what happens in a movie like this is that, you know, you have to go around to the film festivals, the markets, and keep banging away. And we've been doing that for quite a while. And we sat down at the Durban International Film Festival and thought, you know, we need to do something different, because the path we're going, this film will never get made. And the words were, what would Richard Branson do? So what would Richard Branson do to get this movie made? So the idea was we needed something dramatic, and we needed to really, I guess, put ourselves out there, and especially Meg out there, put the story out there. And what we decided to do is we, on the day before Women's Day, so 8th of August every year in South Africa is Women's Day. Meg dressed in a torn petticoat, and we got painted on bruises, and we Meg walked from the center of Cape Town to Muizenberg, where the story takes place. It's about 28 kilometers, right down a main thoroughfare through Cape Town. And the idea was this is part of a crowdfunding campaign, which was through a South African-based funder fund, which so essentially we were raising money for the film. We were raising awareness around abuse against women and children, but also we were raising money for the film, but also for various charities as well.
The Saki Bartman Home.
And that created a massive buzz. Or massive interest. So online, there were tweets, there were thousands of people reading articles. It was on front page of various newspapers because it looked very dramatic. But I think what I should also say about that particular exercise, it was also a learning process for us. So as we went down through Main Road, people stopped along the way, and they were saying, actually, usually people wear makeup to cover up the bruises. That was what I looked like 2 years ago. And so it's quite an awakening to realize that this thing was very real.
It made us more determined than ever to make the film. Actually, that was really important part of the process.
Yeah.
But it certainly raised interest and awareness, and from there we were able to primarily through MultiChoice actually get in there and talk about this project, and very bravely they undertook to part fund the film, which enabled us to basically clear our finances and go forth. And but what I would say is that it was more than that. It became part of the narrative around making the film, and I think for us it was also a huge learning experience because we hear about it, we hear the figures, so many people, so many rapes taking place every day, every few minutes, etc. But when you actually interact with people who have firsthand experience, and it almost felt like it was endemic.
It opened the floodgates as well, apart from all the people who stopped us along the way. I remember Muslim schoolgirls who said our aunties wear scarves, cover these bruises up, and people who said, I left my husband and this is what happened, or I haven't left him. But so it opened up lots of conversations, but also afterwards we just received hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of messages, emails, and it made us more determined than ever that there was a space for this kind of film. So it was a very much part of the filmmaking process, actually, that funding.
Incredibly brave. I mean, I just think the courage on so many levels around this film is what really strikes me. The courage of the acting, the courage that you've just described in raising funds, going out into the community and talking about it. I want to move to something that I think is quite positive about the film, because I think that's important. And that is that Megan, in an interview or a review that I read by Suzette Kotze-Meiberg in the Afrikaans literary site called LitNet, she refers, and I'm quoting to the film, saying, don't expect a romanticization of prostitution as a career. This is not Pretty Woman. It's hard, shocking reality. You've described the film as having some universal and personal themes, including around sexual abuse, obviously, and taboo and stigma. But you also mentioned the notion of empowerment. And I wondered what you saw as indicative of this theme of empowerment in the story and film of Tess.
Okay, that's a really interesting question. Yes, for me, the story at its core is about a woman shedding her misplaced shame, feeling guilt about abuse that she suffered and feeling dirty by that, and realizing that she doesn't need to carry that shame. So it's about shedding misplaced shame and misplaced guilt. And I see that as empowering. And the other thing about this film is I try to show that women can support each other. So there is the immigrant character who kind of takes Tess under her wing. And that was one aspect of that. There's the woman who adopts Tess's baby. But I'm not doing too many spoilers. And I wanted to show that a network of women can also be empowering of each other, and that women need to stand up for each other. So that was also for me a very important part of the film's message. So there were those two things. It was one woman's journey to shedding misplaced guilt, and then it was also a connection between different women. And I thought that both those things were empowering, because I didn't want to just show Tess as being a victim, but also as being someone who not triumphs in a kind of Hollywood sense, but who is able to find some kind of existence despite all the pain and trauma she carries. Because I feel like South African women, so many of us carry huge trauma. And how do you go on? How do you be a mother? How do you carry on? How do you work? How do you just go on day by day if you can't find some kind of empowerment deep within? So that was also a very important part of the film for me.
Okay. So in closing, I want to just mention an interaction I had when I was doing my research in South Africa on sexual violence, which your film raised for me quite dramatically. I'd sort of forgotten about it, where we interviewed a psychologist who had just been with a woman whose 9-year-old daughter had been raped. And the psychologist said to this woman, "What can we do for you? How do we make things easier for you in some way?" And the woman said to her, "It was inevitable that this would happen. I just wish my daughter had been older." And that sort of kept coming back to me as I watched your film. And so what I want to say is this film has, as you yourself have said when it first came out, it's tapped into the zeitgeist in so many countries around the world. It has huge resonance for this country at the moment, Australia, as you're probably aware what's been going on in our halls of parliament. But on every level, this film takes us back to exactly how we started this discussion with you, Meg and Paul, about the need for women to reveal just the extent of the harm, the enduring harm, the actual visceral experience of just how traumatic this is. You can't just talk about it in books. You can't just have it at conferences. It has to be portrayed in all its brutality. And I wanted to say thank you both for making that contribution, because you've succeeded on so many levels, and we wish you huge strength, all of you, and great success in this movie's evolution.
One thing I'd just like to add, thank you so much, is I think we didn't actually know how much it would upset people. And there have been cases where people have been triggered. A very close family member of mine didn't want to speak to me for a long time after coming to the premiere, because we hadn't realized at that point just how much it would upset people. So we do always have it with a trigger warning from now on. But I still think we did the right thing. And it's also, I mean, you never know. For some people, it will be too much. But I know, for example, the film's been shown a lot to prisoners and to male prisoners who've in prison for rape, and it's sparked all sorts of discussions. So I do think it needs to come with a trigger warning, but I do think that this kind of graphic portrayal and sometimes crossing the line, as it were, was necessary. So thank you.
Thank you both.